Hey, we resume aggression and antidotes to part three. But first, some clarifications from previous lectures. First off, a seeming contradiction between what I said in class and what's in the extended notes and handout, which is that women prefer rounder faced men during the luteal phase and view them as more competent, but earlier on stating that overall women view rounder faced men as less competent. And what's up with that? And that is confusing because I was confusing. Here's what you see. During the follicular stage, women are most looking for partners in these studies and small individual differences, blah, blah, etc., showing a preference for males who are viewed as assertive, as socially dominant, as socially efficacious. And under those circumstances, rounder faced men are viewed as less competent at that and among other things, less desirable. But during the luteal phase, what you see is female preference shifts more towards males who are empathic and strong social intelligence and interpersonal skills, and they are viewed as more competent at that. So, sorry for that confusion. Uh, Other thing. So the dorsolateral PFC can inhibit aggression. The septum can inhibit aggression. We're getting some confusing stuff here. Why isn't the septum playing more of a role in our thinking and our quizzing about reining in things like annoyance and wanting to yell at someone? The septum inhibits aggressive behavior in an emotional context. Dorsolateral PFC in a more cognitive one. What do I mean by that? You are about to go out and violently mug an old lady, and just as you're about to, you see, oh my God, she looks just like your beloved grandmother, and you stop yourself from mugging her. That's the septum. Alternative, you're about to mug the old lady, and then you notice there's somebody standing way off in the next corner, and you quickly calculate that if the woman yells for help when you mug her, they're going to be able to hear it. And thus, you refrain from doing so. Those as a contrast. Okay, so marching through, we are just about done with environmental stimuli, so close to being done that I excitedly crossed it off. A few last aspects of environmental triggers for aggression and counters to aggression, and these are mostly about myths. The first one is the myth of crowds, crowding, high densities, high population densities, increasing the amount of violence, aggression, and all of this was due to some spectacularly influential research that was done in the late 50s, early 60s by this guy named John Calhoun, famous, all of that, where he showed he had like a colony of X number of rats at a big enclosure, and they went about their rat business. And then he put the same number in a tighter enclosure, and as he breathlessly reported to the world, and as the media breathlessly reported, they exploded into violence and savagery and bands of rats beating up and killing other ones. And here's the word that somehow always got into the press: cannibalism. Cannibalism broke out. And by the early 60s, Calhoun's was one of the most cited studies, scientific studies in Congress, with, ooh, this is what you have to think about in high density inner city settings and such, because crowding makes mammals, people, more violent. And all that was needed was for a next generation of researchers to do Calhoun type studies, but with far more sort of detail and subtlety and ethological insight, and looking at individual rats, looking at their individual behavior. And what was shown was Overall, crowding does not make rats more violent and aggressive. It makes the rats, the small subset that are already prone in that direction, to being more so. It exaggerates the pre-existing behavioral tendencies in those rats. And for most of the other rats, they became less aggressive under those circumstances. The problem isn't that urban crowding makes people violent, it's that it is an exacerbating factor for people who are already prone towards. That should sound exactly like alcohol from the other day. Alcohol doesn't make people aggressive, it makes aggressive people more aggressive. Same thing with crowding. Next myth, myth of social contagion in crowds. That when like a fight breaks out in a football stadium or something, and like everybody's going to join in between the two rival sides. In this case, the science was done with British football, soccer stadiums, and soccer hooligans, and oh, everybody's rioting and fighting and all of that. And with the advent of closed circuit TV, you could actually watch instant by instant to see who is doing what. And what emerged from that is most of the angry participants in this gang fight between the two loyalists, most participants never throw a punch. Most of them are standing on the sideline. And of those who do throw a punch, as soon as they do so, they discover that really hurts your hand like crazy, and they don't do it again. That most of the fighting is from a subset of individuals. The notion that violence will have the term in the field, emotional contagion, social contagion, is mostly a myth. Third myth to discount, and this is another one that came up from something that just grabbed the public's consciousness, and unfortunately in a misinterpreted way. In the early 60s, the mid 60s, a woman in Manhattan named Kitty Genovese was attacked by a man who raped her repeatedly and then strangled her or stabbed her. And throughout all of this, she was screaming for help. And this was in like the doorway to her apartment house or something. And as everybody learned, dozens, hundreds of people living in the building across the street, all of that, heard that and did not call the police, didn't want to get involved. And this became known as the bystander effect, that people are willing to just stand there when something appalling is happening and look the other way because they don't want to get involved. And it turned out that was not actually what went on. It was in the middle of the winter, so most people had their windows closed with their radiators making steaming, clanging noises, so nobody actually heard it. The few people who did shouted down for him to stop and said, "I'm going to come down and stop you, whatever." The bystander effect is mostly a myth. Scads of people did not hear her being attacked and chose to ignore it. And most studies since then have shown that bystander effects are not the case. It is not until you get a large group of people that you begin to think someone else will step out of the crowd and do something brave and scary. For smaller groups, there's no impact on the number of people standing there as to the likelihood of somebody jumping in and doing the harder, scarier, better thing. Okay, so we transition now to our next category, hormones. Hormones, not hormones in response to you doing something aggressive, not hormones back when you were a fetus, but what do your hormone levels in the previous hours to days have to do with aggressive behavior? And you know right off the bat, we're going to jump into the deep end with testosterone, because in species after species, with a couple of interesting exceptions we'll hear about, species after species, males are more aggressive than females in culture after culture. That is the same case at the time of year that seasonal mating happens and testosterone levels go up. That's when males become more aggressive. Testosterone, this is the biology of why males are such a pain in the ass. Because testosterone causes aggression. Testosterone doesn't cause aggression. So, to begin to dissect that, I have a diagram which, oh, if I only planned ahead, I could have gotten away with not erasing them last week. Yeah, this diagram again. Last week, what does testosterone have to do with sexual behavior? Well, if we set this as normal testosterone levels and normal levels of sexual behavior, but now we're switching the exact normal levels of aggression, average levels of aggression, castrate the individual, primate, mammal, rodent, human, whatever, and down goes aggression from 100% of testosterone levels to zero and reinstate it with the same levels of testosterone and the same punchline. There's still residual. There's still residual aggression there. And what's the residual about? Same deal. The more experience the individual has had with aggression prior to castration, the more residual aggression there is afterward, the more social learning, the more social conditioning. And this is one of the things where you like cut off the testes of a horse if you want him to be nice and tractable, you gelding, or whatever. Or the same thing with when you neuter male dogs, where the rule is don't do it too late of an age, because by then they will have had too much social experience in being aggressive and things like that. There will be that much more residual after neutering them. Same punchline as last week with sex. Now, after castration, reinstate with 20% of average levels, 200% of average levels, and it makes no difference at all because the system is not sensitive to small individual differences. So same punchline, if you have higher levels today than you did yesterday, you are not more likely to be aggressive today. If you have higher levels than the person standing next to you, you are not more likely. Small individual differences. So yes, testosterone is central to typical normative levels of aggression, but there's a strong social component. And after reinstatement, the system isn't sensitive to small individual differences. And that is important. Get somebody who is abusing steroids and they're up, just as with the sexual behavior realm, they're off like 1,000-fold or whatever, they're up in that range, and you see increased aggression. And you see all sorts of pathological instances of people abusing steroids with circumstances like that. But nonetheless, that is our punchline about testosterone. But it then gets subtler. We now have testosterone doesn't cause all types of aggression, and it pretty much doesn't matter what level of testosterone you have. Testosterone doesn't cause aggression. Here's what it does instead. Okay, two versions of this. Here we have 4 primates, and they're together, 4 male primates, and they have formed a dominance hierarchy. A dominates B, C, D, B dominates so on, and you've got this nice linear hierarchy. Now, take individual B and give him testosterone. Give him tons of give him so much testosterone like his amygdala is growing antlers or something. And what's the obvious prediction? His amount of aggression will go up. And that's absolutely the case. The number of aggressive interactions he's involved in will go up. Oh ho, you now predict. Here's what it should look like. Suddenly, B, stoked on testosterone, takes on A and defeats A. There's a change in the hierarchy as a result. That's not what you see. What you see is B is still as terrified of A, still as grovelingly subordinate, all of that. What's the more aggression coming out of B? B is being a total son of a bitch, displacing on poor C and D. Testosterone is not changing the structure of dominance there. It is exaggerating the aggressive components that are already there. Testosterone doesn't cause aggression. It's increasing the volume of the social aggression that is already permissible. That's a world of difference. And that's that same theme of Crowding makes aggressive individuals more aggressive. Alcohol makes it. Testosterone makes individuals who are already more sensitive to environmental cues, evoking threat, aggression, so on, makes them more responsive. And all it does is it exaggerates the pre-existing tendencies. This could be shown in another way, but not on this side. Now let's get much more reductive about it. And you've now stuck electrodes into somebody's amygdala, some male, and you're looking at action potentials. Yes, everyone should recognize this by now. You begin to depolarize, you pass threshold, which actually is more like -30. So I drew this incorrectly. Let's fix that there. Okay, perfect now. And then you have, this is the initiation, the action potential, explosive. You go from negative to positive, and then you rapidly pump out potassium. Don't freak out if you're not familiar with that. That's needless detail. And you go back to the negative state you started at, and then you go further. You hyper polarize to -90 and slowly come back to normal. What is this about? This is, from an informational standpoint, a way of telling the world it's over with. The action potential is over with. Not only have we stopped being positive, not only have we become negative, not only have we gotten to -60, like where we start, we've gone even further to make it absolutely clear it's over with. And what is happening during this period of hyperpolarization? This is a neuron that is now going to require more excitation to have an action potential because it's that much further from threshold. This winds up being a period of relative silence. What's the term given for it in the business? This is a refractory period. What does testosterone do? It causes the refractory period to get shorter in amygdaloid neurons. It changes the composition of some of the potassium channels, some of the sodium channels involved there. It changes things so that the recovery period is faster. What have we just shown? This is now a neuron that could have more action potentials per unit time, that can scream aggressively more per unit time. But notice that this testosterone effect is irrelevant if the neuron hasn't been triggered to have an action potential. So what's testosterone doing here? Is testosterone making for more aggressive related action potentials and amygdaloid neurons by doing this? No. It's doing that if and only if the neuron has been excited by some stimulus, by some external stimulus. Whoa, this should sound like such a familiar theme by now. Benzodiazepines at GABA, if and only if axoaxonic synapses, gene-environment interactions. What does testosterone do to neuronal excitability? It doesn't increase it generically in the amygdala. It increases the sensitivity, the responsiveness to external stimuli. This theme over and over again. Then the testosterone story became even more interesting. And this is work by this guy named John Wingfield, who actually is a bird endocrine behavior person. And despite his name, he claimed he wasn't feeling obliged to become an ornithologist. Ornithologists? Are those bird people? Whatever. John Wingfield is extremely influential rethinking that he did some decades back in proposing what he called the challenge hypothesis. So, what we've just seen with our qualifiers, testosterone doesn't cause aggression, it amplifies socially triggered aggression. Testosterone is essential for most, but not all, individual differences, don't make much of a difference, all of that. But this is all about making sense of aggressive behavior when someone's being challenged, or even impulsive behavior. What Wingfield proposed with the challenge hypothesis is testosterone makes you do whatever you need to hold on to or attain high status when it's being challenged. It makes you do whatever you need to do to hold on to your high status when being challenged. Okay, that suddenly seems very subtle and interesting. And wait, that doesn't tell us anything at all. You're a baboon, you're an alpha male, and somebody is challenging you. And the way you respond to this challenge to your status is by slashing at the guy with your canines. Yeah, you become aggressive. But then you get circumstances where the way to successfully hold on to status when it is being challenged does not involve aggression. Years ago, I got invited. I was giving a talk at some charity fundraiser thing down in Silicon Valley first, after which I stuck around and they had like some auction of auctioning off like all sorts of luxury experiences and items for these rich people there. And it was one of the most amazing things to observe as a primatologist. All I wanted to do was dart some of these people because what you were seeing was a whole bunch of really rich Silicon Valley guys competing as to who was donating the most money, who was going highest in auctioning, competing as to who could commit to the most. And these guys were presumably half drunk because alcohol was flowing, so their judgment was even worse. And they were competing for status by who was willing to give the most money to charity. Whoa, that's something very different. And if the challenge hypothesis is correct, you should be able to take a circumstance, for example, of people playing an economic game and related to Prisoner's Dilemma, Ultimatum Game and such, where over the course of many rounds, you accrue status by making generous offers and give people testosterone. And what do? They become more generous in the game. Testosterone doesn't make you aggressive or make you more responsive to aggressive stimuli with all these qualifiers. Testosterone makes you more likely to do whatever is the socially effective pathway in your universe for holding on to status when it is challenged. That's telling us something really important. For one thing, it's telling us if you took a whole bunch of Buddhist monks and shot them up with testosterone, they would run amok competing to see who could do the most acts of random kindness, random acts of kindness. That would be what their world status might be about. What we're seeing here is if we have way too much male aggression on this planet, it's not because of testosterone. It's because we reward high status for aggression way too readily. In a world in which status was handed out for very different things, testosterone would be having very different effects. Okay, so that's a really important point. What testosterone is and isn't doing, the ways in which it is modulatory rather than causative, and this key point of the challenge hypothesis, it makes you do whatever your culture, your society, whatever values as the right to status. What about testosterone and related androgens in women? We already know it comes out of the adrenal glands. We already know it's about, I don't know, 10% the levels that you see in males. And we already know the punchline from last week, which is it plays a role in sexual motivation in women, much as it does in men, but a smaller role. And in female mammals, the androgens play a role in increasing the likelihood of aggression, female aggression, but not a big effect. Same punchline. When are you seeing female aggression, for example, among primates? And there's certain domains, protectiveness of your kid, like just go try picking up a newborn kitten from mom and see how she reacts to that, and female-female competition in pair bonding species. So now we shift over to sort of this notion of how much is testosterone destiny. And here we look at one of the weirdest species on this planet, one of the most wonderfully weird species. And for a while, it was the coolest species out there to study, and then it got knocked out by naked mole rats that were viewed as even more cool to study. But hyenas. Hyenas. Three different species of hyenas, striped, brown, and spotted. The spotted hyena that runs around in East Africa. This is the stereotypical one making irritating sounds in The Lion King. This is the spotted hyena, has an utterly unique social system as follows. Female hyenas are bigger than male hyenas. Female hyenas have more muscle mass than males do. Females are more aggressive. Females are socially dominant to males. And females have clitorises that get erect and are indistinguishable from male penile erections, are just as big. Whoa, what is up with that? And all sorts of people have done lots of work on this, and starting off with Aristotle, like, I don't know, 2,000 years ago, whenever he was bouncing around. One winter, I don't know, he had nothing else to do, and he dissected a bunch of hyenas that somebody had brought to him from Africa or something, and looking at the private parts of the females and males, he concluded that hyenas are hermaphrodites. Every hyena contains the sexual organs of both sexes. He was wrong. He was so wrong 2,000 years ago. Hyenas are what OBGYN people would call pseudo-hermaphrodites. Female hyenas, despite their enormously enlarged clitoral erections, all of that, they don't have testes. They've got ovaries. They've got a vagina. And if you're a male, you got to really look around closely to find it because it's mostly concealed. What's up with that? Somewhere along the way, there was some sort of mutation, not in the adrenals in the case of hyenas, but in the ovaries, where in addition you were pumping out a whole lot of a testosterone-related androgen. And suddenly you got females being big and muscular and aggressive, and you got a reversal of what is seen in a lot of predatory carnivore types. Lions, for example. What happens with lions? A bunch of lionesses go out and they kill something, and just as they're about to sit down and eat, the male shows up and boots him off the kill and takes it for himself. And then they go hunt something else, and just as they're about to eat, the male shows up and the feeding hierarchy is the male, who has done none of the work, the females, and then the lion cubs. And one of the really distressing bits of reality out there is with average litter sizes 8, 10, 12 lion cubs, almost all of them starve to death in their first year of life. Now, instead, we've got the hyenas, where the females are big and aggressive as hell, and poor, starving, sniveling male hyenas are the ones who go out and do the hunting and kill something and are just about to eat, and the females come in and boot them off the kill and let their kids eat. And the feeding hierarchy there is hyena pups, females, and males. You do that, and your kids are going to survive, which is very helpful because for, I don't know, pregnancy reasons, I say, obviously, hyenas give birth only to twins as opposed to large litters. So you really want to have your kids survive there if you've only got 2 of them to deal with instead of a dozen or so. Big selective pressure for that to have occurred. So all of that is great. Females should all do this. They should all go and do this because their kids are more likely to survive because you've got elevated androgens and you get weirdo sexual stuff going on down there. But you're big and muscular and aggressive and your kids survive, except there's one problem though, which is if you have females androgenized prenatally, as female hyenas are, because mom has high androgen levels, androgenized, you'll come out more aggressive, more muscular. Maybe we'll see in a little bit. You come out all that way, but you come out with a hypothalamus that doesn't do ovulatory cycles. It is a simplified male hypothalamus that instead is doing stuff like this instead of having these reliable. Somehow, if you were a typical human prenatally androgenized like that female, you were not going to be particularly fertile long afterward because you won't have cyclic hormone release. Somehow, female hyenas, their hypothalamuses, evolved a means to protect itself. The hypothalamus protects itself from the prenatal androgenization for mom. The aggression related parts of the brain, just to simplify, sure as hell are affected by the prenatal androgen levels. So somehow females have pulled it off of being these pseudo hermaphrodites where they have external genitalia that looks male and they're big and aggressive and all of that, but they're still fertile and their fetuses come out already soaked in aggressive parts of the brain activating. Here's a really interesting finding about hyenas. Hyenas always give birth to twins. Oh, that's cool. That sounds like pair bonding. We're familiar with that. They always give birth to twins. This is not what people used to think because you would always see a mom with her newborn that comes out of the hole in their den that's been dug into some termite mound, and out comes the kid. And oh, there's mom and her child and all of that. And it wasn't until people started doing stuff like snaking fiber optic things down in there that they noticed females always give birth to twins. And because of the high androgens, these pups are born already with their eyes open and with canines. And the first one out turns around and kills the second. Siblicide right after birth. And what we have is a bet hedging strategy once again, and only one of them emerges. So, this wild social system, and you've got males who are socially dominated by the females, and you see a very interesting thing in all sorts of mammals out there and primates. Males get erections as a sign of dominance. You got male monkeys waving their erections at each other, sort of threateningly, and all of that. If you're a male hyena, you are not dominant. You are terrified of every female out there. What do males do when they are threatened by females? They get erections. What are they saying? Please don't hurt me. I'm just one of those snivelly males. You see? Can't you see? Please don't beat up on me. In hyena males, stress causes erections rather than the opposite, and something with the wiring has to be completely different with the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so those are hyenas, and they're an amazing exception in another regard, in that years ago, the first hyena colony on Earth was established in Berkeley, up in the hills back there, and a bunch of hyena pups were brought over for East Africa, and they were put into this group, and of course, what you wait to see is, are females going to emerge as dominant? Is the normal social hierarchy sort of thing in hyenas off in the wild, is that going to emerge? And what was shown was it did, but it took longer than in the wild. It took longer for females to start dominating males. When they were pups, males were doing more of the domination. And what slowly emerged, slower than out there, was the normal social system. Why was it slower? There were no adults for them to look at. They weren't getting socialization as to how you go about dealing with other hyenas. You had a fixed action pattern of female dominance, but no modeling for it, so it took longer for it to come out and to be socially appropriate. So a big take-home lesson there about the hyenas with that, which is interactions again between biological stuff and social context and all of that. We know this in our sleep by now. Okay, what about other hormones and female aggression, which sends us barreling back to the ovulatory cycle? And what you see is You've got here we got estrogen peaking around the time of ovulation just before, then progesterone goes up there all the way, and we've seen the drop there have something to do with lack of or decline in sexual motivation, sexual proactivity. What about aggression? What you see is there is indeed a peak in aggression, in aggressiveness in female mammals, female primates around this point of time, including in humans, around the time of one's period. Oh my God, PMS, women becoming aggressive and violent and all of that. And the criminology literature is just littered with notions of increased violence. That's around the time of the month where women are most likely to be murderers and all of that. What is actually the case is you look at your average woman and around the time of menses, there tends to be like some subtle shifts in personality, increase in irritability, increase in some depressive tendencies. We'll look at that more shortly. And a small subset of women, rather than being premenstrual, have perimenstrual syndrome, which is they have enormously strong personality changes there and affective changes. And there have indeed been a few court cases of women who were violent criminals only around this time. One particular case in England, the woman in it, her trend towards being violent was also a very good diary keeper. So it was possible after she was arrested to go back, and you could see like every 28 days she was holding up a bank or something back in her records corresponding to that. And what was interesting was she was put on anti-estrogens, anti-progestins, and that pattern disappeared. So a small subset of women have massive personality changes around that time, and in a subset that does indeed take the form of an increased likelihood of aggression. So let's look at ethological principles and where this is coming in. What is this about? It is what we already know, the drop in progesterone having something to do with sex drive. The drop in progesterone and the much smaller drop of estrogen playing a role in the emergence of perimenstrual mood changes, the irritability, the depressiveness. And what will be seen by the time we get to the depression lecture is it's not so much how much progesterone you got at that point or how much estrogen, but the ratio of the two. And the ratio is very influential on likelihood of what personality changes, and do you go in the depression direction or the irritability. In addition, there's a big drop in opioid levels, endogenous opioid levels around that time. All of this is fitting in there. The drop in progesterone. Progesterone, let's see, we heard about progesterone the other week. Progesterone, not just as a like usual hormone, but progesterone or its close relatives as co-binding to the GABA receptor. Remember that. What does it do when it is binding to the GABA receptor? If and only if there's GABA around, blah, blah. What is it doing there? It's enhancing the inhibitory effects of GABA. It has effects on decreasing anxiety. Progesterone can decrease anxiety, and by way of this GABA receptor, and the sense is this is part of it, the drop in progesterone playing some role in the irritability, the social withdrawal, things of that sort. Okay, so hooray. Now we superimpose ethological principles. Here we have levels of aggression. Levels of aggression over the course of the cycle, and we've now moved menses to the middle there. And this is looking at one particular female over the course of the year. And what you see is aggregate all the time she is aggressive. It's right around here, around the time of her menses. And now we look at a second female, and you see no change whatsoever. Huh. Now, instead of looking at their aggressive behavior, we look at the amount of time they spend grooming. This other female suddenly is much more socially withdrawn around this time. Where's the one in red? There's no effect at all. What's going on here? I can be having opposite effects. And you should be thinking straight out of the limbic lecture and the ethology lectures. These are two different individuals. This is what a high-ranking female baboon looks like. And this is what a low-ranking female does. She probably would love to be more aggressive, but she doesn't have the social option to do so, and instead, social withdrawal. Oh, individual differences there in the context of ethological principles. By the way, this was my wife's doctoral thesis, looking at the cyclicity there, showing that. And what you see here is, oh, it's not just the hormones, it's what's your social place in your culture. So we see a human version of it, which is the magnitude of mood switches, mood shifts over the course of the cycle in women on the average, women having standard premenstrual mood shifts rather than perimenstrual syndrome, sort of like a diagnosable one there. And your average woman, the amount of mood shifting there, the magnitude of the effect is there reliably, and it's smaller than weekday weekend effects on mood. It is smaller than all sorts of other cultural inventions superimposed on it. You can see the magnitude of somebody's birthday's effect on this sort of thing is bigger than hormones themselves. Yeah, endocrine stuff, but in a social context. And we, unlike baboons, invented weekdays and weekends and grabbing life, carpe diem, carpe the weekend, that sort of thing. We see these endocrine effects. They're important. They are certainly not deterministic by the time it gets to us. Okay, so more insights into some of these switches here, some of these changes, and just to look at where culture is coming in. In addition, there's been this notion floating around in sort of biological anthropology for close to a century now that there are massive cultural differences in how much one's period involves mood changes. And all of this got started off by Margaret Mead when she went to Samoa and hung out there with adolescent girls for a couple of years. And she came back and famously reported in her bestseller, Coming of Age in Samoa, women in Samoa have never even heard about getting cramps or feeling crummy around this time. They don't get any symptoms of changes there whatsoever. They don't get cramping. Nothing happens because they are so groovy and relaxed, and perimenstrual changes from cramping to behavior is an invention of uptight Western cultures. That established a theme for decades afterward in the anthropology literature of perceiving that to be the case. And over, this was like the wisdom of the savage, the wisdom of the non-Westernized, the lack of cramping in the non-Westernized. And she came back and reported this. If you're uptight, you get severe perimenstrual mood changes. And this fit into all sorts of very influential, very well accepted crackpot theories about what's going on at this point and individual differences. There's a small literature that there are personality differences that make some women more or less likely to have large mood changes there, and it has a little bit to do with propensity towards anxiety. That one is for real. There's a completely silly literature suggesting that women who are more emotionally dependent, however, that was defined in the 1950s when those studies were being done, women who were more emotionally dependent had more severe perimenstrual symptoms, all of that. And then, of course, the Freudians came in there. The Freudians came up with like an irresistible, totally great soundbite that perimenstrual mood changes. Oh, hell, as long as we're at it and getting psychosomatic, even the water retention and the cramping and all of that, it's all in your mind, and it's all built around the emotional unconscious conflict that women have between, okay, get this, hold on to your hats, that women have between being productive versus reproductive, Whoa, productive versus reproductive. You better bet all those Freudians went out and got ice cream in the afternoon. They came up with that sort of catchy jingle there. Ooh, perimenstrual mood changes are due to the unconscious conflict that women have between being productive and reproductive, because this is telling you, because of the menses, that you have once again failed to conceive, which is your purpose in life, according to whatever the Kansas City Chiefs place kicker is from the other day. But that was their notion. This was all due to Freudian conflict and stuff of that sort. And somewhere along the way, Margaret Mead underwent a major takedown, and that not only was everything she reported about Samoan culture completely wrong, but in retrospect, she just went there starry eyed and believed everything everyone told her. And interviews, there was an anthropologist a few decades ago that really unearthed what her time in Samoa was like, interviewing some of those adolescent girls who hung out with her, who were then by then old women, and they would say, yeah, like this white lady shows up and she's like hanging out with us, and everything we do, she says, is great, and she's like knows, my God, how she manages to like feed herself or not get eaten by predators. She is so naive, whatever. So we just made up stuff. We said, oh, no, nobody, we have sex all the time and there's no violence and no periods. I've never heard of anything like that where people suddenly get uptight, and they were just messing with her. This was her falling for it and starting off in decades of the, ooh, menstrual shifts in mood is an invention of uptight, ungroovy Western cultures. So we see amid all of those cultural explanations, those psychoanalytic, those psychological ones, nonetheless, we're dealing with a biological phenomenon with people beginning to understand the workings of it. And just before you start getting all into that inevitability of some stuff, remember again the cultural modifiers, bigger fluctuations weekday versus weekend in Western women. So this is important. It's not as important in us as in a baboon, and it is there not because of crackpot psychoanalytic notions. It's a biological phenomenon. And we understand by now the progesterone interacting with GABA, the ratio of the two, probably has something to do with it. Okay, more hormone stuff. We now come to the hormone of stress, glucocorticoids, interacting with the sympathetic nervous system, epinephrine, fear, arousal, emergency, all of that. And we get the exact same issue that we dealt with last week with sexual behavior, which was arousal in brainstem, hypothalamic regions, increased heart rate. That thing we got to last week's point was the physiology of someone having an orgasm and the physiology of somebody being murderously in a rage is extremely similar. And this week, all we do is flip it around. The physiology of being in a murderous rage is not all that different from the physiology of orgasm. In both cases, you have a body with increased metabolic demands. In both cases, heart beating faster. All what are we at here is that same theme again as from last week with Elie Wiesel. The opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is indifference. Physiologically, intense love, intense arousal of any sort, intense hatred, physiologically, they have much more in common with each other than with a state of indifference. And his argument being the world's pains are more a function of indifference rather than the different types of arousal states. Little bit more on that in terms of stress hormones going into it. What you see is stress by way of glucocorticoids make organisms less empathic. And this has been shown in a zillion studies, and people become tunnel visioned like 3 minutes into the lockdown as to whose well being people were caring about and how wide their sort of umbrella of empathic concern was, got really, really narrow. And what you see is glucocorticoids have something to do with this. This is research by a guy named Jeffrey Mogul at McGill University in Montreal. Some of it was done in collaboration with me, but him showing that rats have a phenomenon of empathy. You take a rat and you give it mild shocks now and then, and it's emitting fear pheromones, and its heart rate is going up, and all of that. And you put another rat here, and if it's in the neighborhood of this rat giving off distress vocalizations, all of that, you see this rat's pain threshold gets lower. An empathic contagion sort of thing, what was defined as like a rudimentary version of empathy. But then comes our predictable aha. It's not just feeling this way, feeling more attuned to pain when it's any other old rat that's in pain. It depends on who it is. If it's your cat cage mate, it works. If it's a rat of the same strain you are, meaning almost genetically identical, it works. If it is a strange, unrelated rat, you're paying no attention to its pain signaling. So what we did in one study was speculating that what stress, the stress of a stranger, the stress of a novel rat who smells unrelated and you don't know all of that, that the stress has something to do with the decrease in empathy. And what we showed was that if you threw in a drug which blocked glucocorticoid effects in the anterior cingulate, suddenly the pains of a stranger rat had just as much of an impact on you as the pains of the cage mate. It's the stress of being around someone who doesn't count as an us, which makes you narrow your window of empathy. And in that study, I had nothing to do with this part. He then went on to show something or other with this with human subjects where he gave them the same drug, and loss of empathy during stress is mediated by glucocorticoids, and it involves narrowing your windows as to whose pain you care about. Finally, in terms of pain and stress hormones, all of that, sociopaths provide a very interesting exception in that, in general, sociopaths show no evidence of empathy. They don't feel anybody else's pain, all of that. And a discovery replicated since then over and over is sociopaths have trouble feeling somebody else's pain because they don't feel pain. They are very pain resistant. Sociopaths have extremely high thresholds for pain, for finding it aversive, for it increasing heart rate, for it causing glucocorticoid release. They have extremely high thresholds for that. They don't feel. So they don't feel somebody else's pain much. And this maps onto all sorts of bits and pieces about sociopathic behavior. What it also brings in is if this is someone who is organically not particularly responsive to pain or punishment, punishment does not curb the unacceptable behaviors of a sociopath because they don't feel the adversity of it as much. And all sorts of people are trying to figure out the bases of that. Okay, so those are hormone effects. And now we're going to leap over this briefly, except for one key thing there, which is neuronal structure of the brain, things that have emerged in previous months to years. And what is now a solidly replicated finding is people with PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, the amygdala expands. Growth of more processes, synapses become more excitable, the amygdala gets bigger, while, as you know, chronic stress, the hippocampus is shriveling, just the opposite. The amygdala gets bigger. You see this on brain imaging of people with PTSD, and you see it being correlated with threshold for finding faces to be threatening, ease with which defensive autonomic responses are triggered. What PTSD does is give your brain structurally that is more likely to find menace all over the place. Okay, So now we shift over to the world of adolescence and childhood and all sorts of theories about what environmental factors have to do with the emergence of aggression, the emergence of pro-social behavior, emergence of compassion, emergence, all of that stuff. And no surprise, this is an area where all sorts of theorizing has been occurring at 10 times the rate of actual data points being accrued. Three very influential theories about the role of environment in bringing about violence and aggression. The first one was attributable overwhelmingly to good old Konrad Lorenz. Konrad Lorenz imprinting his duckies and Nobel Prize and member of the Nazi Party participating throughout World War II. Konrad Lorenz had some very interesting theories about aggression, which in retrospect were not very surprising. This he put together in one of the most unfortunately influential books of the 1960s, a book he wrote called On Aggression, and he gave his model of what the environment has to do with aggression. And clearly, what had gone on was Konrad Lorenz had spent a lot of time in bathrooms and men's rooms watching flush toilets, flush urinals, the ones that automatically flush after a certain amount of time, because he came with his toilet bowl model of aggression as follows. You have the tank filling up with water. And he actually used words like hydraulic. This is the hydraulic pressure that an organism feels towards being aggressive. As time goes by, the water levels get higher and higher, more of a propensity towards aggression. And where does environment come in at this point? The higher the water levels, the less of environmental triggers needed to pull out aggression. And as the key point in his model, finally, when it gets up to the top, showing that this was not just any old toilet that Lorenz was obsessing over, but an automatic flush toilet. When the levels get high enough, you get spontaneous aggression, independent of environment. Spontaneous aggression, when it's gone on long enough, and what happens after you flush the toilet or it flushes automatically, it is depleted of water. Your tendency towards aggression is depleted afterward. Note what goes into Lorenz's model here. First off, that there are domains where aggression is inevitable. When you get up to the point of hydraulic a point where environment is irrelevant. And in the aftermath of such aggression, you are depleted. Aggression becomes less likely afterward. And in every possible domain, this model turned out to be gibberish. For one thing, all you have to do, if we were all in a room here together, I would like canvass people as to how many people in the room had actually ever murdered someone, and who thought it was likely that at some point in their life they would murder someone. And you see, aggression is not universal. Aggression is not inevitable. We don't have tanks of water filling up in our heads, which get high enough and the urge becomes irresistible. And the other thing wrong with that model is aggression does not cause depletion. Aggression increases the likelihood of subsequent aggression on the part of somebody. The tank doesn't empty out. So this was Lorenz with his model, and his model, which fits very easily into what we know about him already. A famous quote of his in the 70s, you can't have love without hate, or something, the exact wording. Love and hate, they go hand in hand, like, what's the song? Okay, I'm not going to sing it, but love and marriage. No, love and hatred, according to Lorenz, goes together hand in hand, inevitable. You can't have one without the other. What are we looking at? This is the biological theorizing and imaginings of someone whose underlying premise was, don't blame me, I was just following orders. I was following orders in the 1940s, and I'm just following orders of my hydraulic toilet. So much for Lorenz and his really unfortunate influence on thinking about aggression in the 1960s. Another model For many, many decades, Marxists have thought about aggression, and their viewpoint is very straightforward. Aggression is about frustration. It's about lack of outlets. It's about resource inequity. And in a world in which nobody is strapped for resources, in a world in which no one is frightened or frustrated and everybody shares blah blah, there will be no aggression. Some evidence for that. One piece we've already heard, which was poverty is not a predictor of high rates of violence. Poverty amid plenty, seeing what you don't have, inequality. And that fits perfectly with this Marxist model. It is the psychological fact being drummed into your head over and over that some people are getting a better deal than you have. Aggression, violence, crime, whether violent or otherwise, all of that being more likely as a function of inequality in a society rather than absolute levels of poverty or wealth. So that certainly fits with that model. Something that argues against it, though, as follows, which is something very interesting. You look at primate populations, and for example, I observed this in my baboons in the mid-1980s during a period when there's a drought, when the rains have failed, when there's a famine, when all the humans around there are going through a crisis. Baboons did as well because they were starving. Resources are limited there because there's a famine. There's not as much food around. By a Marxist model, aggression should go through the roof at that point. And what you see instead is in other species and in humans as well, during periods of extreme duress, famine, starvation, aggression goes down. And that gave rise to a term in the field, aggression, as behavioral fat, which is to say, you're sitting there, you're well fed, you're not hungry, things are fine, nobody's going to mate with you right now, so why not pick a fight with someone? Aggression is what you do when you have a surplus of resources, and like, why not behavioral fat? A wonderful term for it, because what it's showing is as soon as resources become slim there, the behavioral fat dissipates and aggression goes down. Exactly the opposite of the Marxist model. Within that realm, that begins to explain something interesting about clan violence. When you look at these cultures of honor that we've heard about already in terms of like ecological predictors of, when you see cultures of honor, you get these vendettas that go on for centuries, the McCoys and the Hatfields, and vendettas and revenge, and your grandchildren are trying to be vengeful about something that was done to your generation and just going back and forth for years and years and years and years. When you think about it, there's a way within this Marxist model of framing this, which is there's a limited resource. Only one of the two sides can say, we're the last one who did something aggressive. We trounced them so bad they never came back again. Only one side can have that, and the way to make sure the other side can't claim that is to go back at them. And they come back at you and go back at them because the limited resource is being the one who had the last say in the matter. So a way of framing that. Finally, we have behaviorism and shiny foreheaded B.F. Skinner and the whole notion that like anything could be made more or less frequent with the right control of rewards and reinforcements and our behaviorist universals. And in a behaviorist framework, thinking about aggression, it is as modifiable as any other behavior. And to see the flaws with that, all you have to do is look at some very critical statistics in this country, which is now over the decades, over the years, as different states, as the country as a whole, bans capital punishment or brings it back but never actually does that, or rates of capital punishment, what you would predict is from a behaviorist model, whoa, being put to death, that's a pretty major negative reinforcement all of there. And what the studies show is imposing the death penalty does decrease the incidence of premeditated violence. Fewer people are going to go take out an ad saying, I'm willing to kill somebody if you give me enough money for hire. Yeah, that goes down. That's not the most common domain where we see violence. Punishment, the extent of punishment, the likelihood of you being caught, the likelihood of you being convicted, the likelihood of getting a lengthy jail sentence or a capital punishment or whatever, none of those have any consistent effect on impulsive violence. Impulsive, where this is the guy in the bar there, and somebody says something insulting, and before you know it, out has come the gun, and somebody has been shot. In those instances, somebody who's now pulled out the gun and is deciding whether or not to shoot this person, they're not standing there saying, wait a second, didn't I just read that the state legislature just brought back the death penalty and that would really suck if I get put to death for this? No, nobody thinks that, because in those moments of impulsive, passionate violence, nobody is thinking. We know the prefrontal cortex is out of there, and it's amygdala talking to basal ganglia, talking to motor cortex, habitual stuff, all of that. That's a realm in which behaviorist models of likelihood of punishment has no influence whatsoever on rates of violence. Okay, we transition now having gotten this overview of sort of the broad theoretical models with which people think about early development and the emergence of aggression and all of that. So, what do studies in child development, and we're going to start with that before going to that weirdo specialty of adolescence, what do you see? And as with much of child development, the whole field is dominated by stages. Stages. You crawl before you can cruise, before you can walk, before you could run. There's stereotypical transitions. There is no kid out there who learns how to run before they learn how to stand up. Similarly, you had language comprehension coming shortly before language production, and that is a completely reliable transition. Stages, maturational stages in kids relevant to prosocial and antisocial behavior. And you see the pieces beginning to emerge extremely early in life, in infancy, at a couple of weeks of age, a couple of months. What's one of the first things you see is infants making distinctions between animate and inanimate objects. How do you tell? Because you do stuff like you track how long a kid is looking at something. You track if their heart rate changes in response to looking at something interesting, things of that sort. And it's around then that kids start first differentiating between animate and inanimate and showing a preference for looking at the animate. Interesting exception. The literature is a little bit mixed on this, but individuals destined to eventually get a diagnosis of severe autism either do not show this dichotomy between animate and inanimate, or it's greatly delayed and emergent. Okay, so that is a first step. What comes out soon after that is the first sense a kid has that they are a me, that there's a me, and me is separate from the rest of the world, that there's ego boundaries making you, separate from everything. When do you see this not working? This is where you see like a 14-month-old kid and mommy has cut her finger on something, and for the rest of the day, this toddler is walking around holding their finger because it hurts. Because somehow there's no barrier between them and mommy, there's no ego boundaries there. And what you begin to see is the development of a kid realizing that I am a me separate from the rest of the world, even separate from mommy. And you see that sort of behavior disappear. Then you begin to see theory of mind, which we all know about by now. When do kids, when do chimps, when do organisms begin to be able to realize that somebody else has different thoughts than they do? Somebody else has different information, and we know the drill with that. very well by now. And in human kids' theory of mind, with that Sally Ann test, the one where you see him put in there, you go out of the room, it's changed, and now the kid is watching that one, where you begin to see kids emerging with theory of mind between ages 3 and 5. My kids, of course, got theory of mind on the very morning of their third birthdays, but that's the typical range where you see it. And this is where things begin to get interesting in a number of ways. Theory of mind is a necessity for something, but it is not sufficient. Theory of mind is a first step, knowing somebody else has different thoughts, information than you, as the stepping stone for somebody else has different feelings than you. The possibility of somebody else being in pain when you are not. Theory of mind viewed as a prerequisite for the emergence of empathy. Sociopaths have spectacular emotional theories of mind. They are incredibly good at understanding what other people are thinking and other people feeling. And what that is for is to manipulate them, to exploit them. Understanding that other people have different feelings than you do is a prerequisite for feeling their pain and acting empathically, but it's also a prerequisite for feeling their pain, except you don't really feel pain, but you've now just gotten insights as to how best to manipulate them. So that aspect of maturation there is not enough to explain an emergence of the capacity for empathy. The other confusing thing about it, so we've got this very cognitive model here. By around ages 3 to 5, kids can think through, oh my God, they know something that I don't, or I know something that they don't, or they're upset and I don't feel badly at all, but maybe that's like something that's aversive and I should do something about it. All of that's great in this very cognitive framework. But then you get these astounding circumstances where, like, you have an adult, always the researcher working on it, who's sitting there pretending to be crying about something, and a surprising percentage of like 12-month-old toddlers or whatever will come over and try to give them their pacifier, or give them their stuffy, or give them something to make them feel better. Oh my God, 12-month-olds feel empathy in that sort of sense. So much for this maturational model. Ooh, at age 3, I knew they think differently from me. At age 4, I realized they have different emotions, all that. Ooh, you're seeing empathic stuff emerging at kids at much earlier ages. Maybe this whole theory of mind stuff is nonsense. So, one counter interpretation, and a very cynical one that almost certainly explains some of what's going on, is the person is sitting there, the grad student who's part of the project is sitting there pretending to weep and cry and loudly and all of that. And the toddler comes over and gives them their stuffy so that they feel better and stop crying. Is it because the toddler feels their pain, or is it because the toddler finds their crying irritating and unsettling as hell? Will you shut up, please? Here, hold my stuffy. Stop crying, because I find that to be very distressing, because I'm still not completely sure if you're the one who's upset, or if I'm the one who's upset, or if there's a boundary, all of that. That seeming empathy in kids at that age, is that just trying to reduce an aversive stimulus? So that is a possible counterinterpretation. So, jumping back into the cognitive realm, we have just set ourselves up for the cognitive development of morality uber alles once kids are figuring out, ooh, people have different thoughts than me, people have different emotions, this cognitive landmark of all of that. You then begin to look at the cognitive landmarks of moral development. And this is where we move into the world of this super influential psychologist, Lawrence Kohlberg at Harvard in the 60s, incredibly influential, one of the most cited psychologists of the 20th century. And he seemingly taught the world, how do kids grow into having a moral compass? And like a lot of these here, he had a stage model. He had 6 stages of moral development, and stages 1 and 2 he called pre-conventional, 3 and 4 conventional, 5 and 6 post-conventional. I've never been able to stay awake when reading his stuff long enough to really get the distinctions between 1 and 2, or between 3 and 4, and 5 and 6. But what I'm going to collapse them into here is very roughly what pre-conventional moral rules are about are entirely ego-based. Why is it that you shouldn't steal a cookie when no one's looking? Because if I get caught, I'm going to get punished. Pure self-interest going on in there. I restrain my behavior out of the fact that the consequence will be aversive. Then the transition to the conventional stage. And there you get this broader horizon of thinking. Why is it that you don't steal a cookie? Because it's against the rules. It's against the laws. A more elaborated version of that. What if everybody stole cookies? There would be anarchy and all of that. Why don't you do that? Because there are agreed upon conventions of behavior. When you are not stealing a cookie just because you're afraid of getting caught, you are pre-conventional. You are not at that stage yet. Conventional, dealing with the fact that there are agreed upon rules among everyone there, and the rules themselves can wind up being appealing. Law and order, where independent of what the rule is, rules are good things because it makes society work better. And if people didn't follow rules, there would be chaos. And then there's the post-conventional stage. And in this rarefied transcendent one, this is saying, I don't care if that's the rule. I don't care if this is what everybody thinks you should do in this circumstance. I don't care if I'm going to be punished for doing this. This is the right thing to do. This is the right thing, totally independent of what sheep-like conformist rules everybody else follows. This is not okay with me. Implicit in a post-conventional stage of moral development is a remarkably unique thing that humans develop into as follows: the ability to make the statement, how could I live with myself if I did that? How would I fall asleep at night? Internalizing all this stuff where you are the litmus test for what is moral and not, and at its most noble and heroic, you are willing to pay the price, even an enormous price, the ultimate price, for what you see as the right thing to do, no matter what everybody else says. So, pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional, and one of the most interesting things that came out of Kohlberg's work was showing everybody doesn't get to the same level, showing most people do not reach post-conventional Kohlberg reasoning. Most people instead stop somewhere in the because there are rules. And the world would be a chaotic, miserable place if there weren't rules, and that's why we should follow them. Is only a subset of people who show post-conventional thinking. So that was wildly influential, enormously so, and of course there's been some very, very valid criticisms. First off, overwhelmingly a weird literature, studying weird subjects. Second, overwhelmingly a literature biased towards studying boys rather than girls. Psychologist Susan Noland Hoxema, who used to be here at Stanford before she moved to Michigan and then Yale and died at a appallingly early age of what was apparently a medical mistake. She was the first one to emphasize moral development in boys and girls on the average is not the same. Boys are more concerned with justice. Girls are more concerned with fairness. And when you look at girls' development, you don't see as strict of transitions of Kohlberg stages. What you also see is they're not strict transitions. As with any of these stage ones, you don't wake up one morning and that's the day you were suddenly conventional And up until then, you were pre-conventional. What you'll see is a kid is transitioning, and in some circumstances, they're at this level. In others, they're at that level. As a general rule, with strong emotional arousal, people default back to the lower level in their decision making. Oh, it's not clean transitions. Okay, yeah, we are willing to deal with that. This is like idealized of clear transitional stuff. Yeah, it's murky, and depending on how you're feeling that day and what you had for breakfast, and maybe how emotional you're feeling, you could be waffling between this or that stage. But the biggest problem with it is one that we already know about, that has already been alluded to, which is this is the universe of how do we make moral decisions. We think our way towards it. We think our way because we know we're likely to get punished, or we know there are laws, or we know we won't be able to live with ourselves no matter what the rules are. And this is our cognitive realm. And what we did a lot in previous lectures is see how much instead we are feeling our way to moral decisions. That work by Jonathan Haidt, limbic structures are activating when we're deciding in a moral quandary before cortical structures are. Model for it as well. Every time somebody is saying, I can't tell you why, but it's wrong when they do that. All they're saying is, my limbic system has made a decision, but it hasn't had enough influence on my cortex yet to have concocted a supposedly rational explanation. This has been part of this massive transition from an emphasis on moral development as a cognitive process to it as a moral process. What goes into the transition between feeling empathy and acting compassionately? And you see sort of when there's distress at injustice, a stages of that as well. You see kids at a stage where what unfairness is about is self-interest. It's not fair. I didn't get it when everybody else was supposed to. Pure self-interest. Then the ability to generalize, to extend emotionally to it's not fair. They didn't get a piece. All the rest of us did. That as a maturational stage. From there, moving on to the notion that there's a difference between intentional harm and inadvertent harm. There's a difference between egalitarianism and meritocracy. Everyone should get the exact same thing. Egalitarianism, meritocracy, the first time kids are saying they worked harder for it, they're more deserving. Or the first time kids are saying they had less in the past, they should get more now. How much does somebody's Kohlberg moral stage actually predict about what they do in the world? And we're going to see it predicts next to nothing. So, more aspects of child development. When does violence emerge? Very briefly here, showing more exposure, kids being exposed to violence early in life, within the family, within the neighborhood. All of those are predictors of higher rates of violence. Coming into that is a critical concept in sort of psychobiological developmental stuff, the ACE score. How many adverse childhood experiences has this kid had? And by now there's a standardized score of 1 to 10 or 0 to 10, 10 different categories. And like every pediatrician has some version of this up there, 10 different categories. Were you psychologically abused as a child? Were you physically abused? Were you sexually abused? Were you witness to any of the above? Was the family member was incarcerated? Was there socioeconomic stress? And for each one of those, you get another point from the unbelievably lucky 0 up to the unimaginable 10. And that winds up being highly predictive of things like antisocial violence in adulthood. How's this for a number? For every step higher you go on the ACE scale, when what your childhood was like, there's about a 35% increased likelihood that you will have a history as an adult of antisocial violence. If you're a woman, about a 35% increased likelihood of having had a teen pregnancy in either sex, about 35% increased likelihood of problems with substance abuse, mood disorders like depression and such. So early environmental adversity playing a huge role in likelihood of violence coming out the other end. Okay, so in that regard, what's one of the most dangerous versions of exposure to violence early in life is being exposed to rationalizations for violence. And this is where culture comes in like crazy because it is early in life that kids are being taught either thou shalt not kill ever, or thou shalt not kill, but if you kill them, we'll give you an award, or cultural notions of, does mistreatment mean you have to answer with vengeance, a culture of honor? Does it mean you turn the other cheek? Does it mean you answer with vengeance to what was done to your ancestors 5 generations ago? Cultural acculturation at that point is incredibly important along the lines of how and when is violence rationalized. And I think we get a very important hint in it here, looking at, and people have done all sorts of research on this in recent years, big surprise, looking at the relationship between extreme religiosity and support for violent religious fundamentalism. And what the studies show is it's not how often you pray, it's not how often you go to you reflect on the laws and all of that. The predictor is how much time you spend in a place of prayer surrounded by co-religionists. How much time are cultural values being inculcated? How much is it a set of shared traits? And that process starts very, very early in life. Okay, so let us stop at this point, and we will continue filling in adolescence and barrel to the head to the end of it when we come back on Monday. So have a good weekend.